right, today I'm going to be doing a read aloud of the text The Boy Nobody Knew by Faith Ringgold. This is an essay about the author. She is a writer, an artist, writer, and activist. She was born in 1930 in Harlem, New York. In the 1960s, Ringgold, so when they say somebody's last name, they're referring to the person, protested against the art world's exclusion of many Black and female artists. Ringgold is best known for her story quilts, works of art combining fabric, painting, and storytelling, which have been shown in museums and galleries across the world. Background: multiple sclerosis is a disease that affects the central nervous system and disrupts the flow of information between the brain, spinal cord, and the rest of the body. It can cause a wide range of physical problems, although different people with MS can have very different symptoms. Okay, so given that background information, I am guessing this, or I should say inferring, that this story has something to do with the disease of multiple sclerosis. It was one of those hot summer nights in Harlem in 1937. Mother, Daddy, and Uncle Hilliard were talking about their childhood growing up in Jacksonville, Florida. When Uncle, and I'm just going to say H, came to visit, we never missed a chance to laugh at his stories. Everything he said was funny. We kids would just cover our mouths and laugh into our hands. As long as we were quiet, Mother would forget it was late and we were still up. Uncle H was at the door now saying goodbye. Each of us kids could give him a hug and he'd give us a silver dollar to spend on our vacation. Soon school would be closed, and in a few weeks we'd be going to stay with the Pattersons and their kids in Atlantic City. Barbara and Andrew would spend their silver dollars long before then, but I saved mine in a piggy bank. When Mother needed some cash, she'd borrow from me, replacing the coins with buttons and washers, though it would be years before I found that out. You sure are crazy, H, Mother yelled down the stairs at Uncle H. He'd told my father, "Now, don't you get no uglier till I get back. You need a license now to walk down the street." Daddy just laughed and laughed, and then the house was quiet. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the superintendent running up the stairs and knocking on everyone's door. "Fire! Fire! Everybody outside!" So we know Dr. Butts as a superintendent who runs our schools. The superintendent of an apartment complex would be like in charge of all the apartments. All right, everyone's doors open and all the tenants, that means people who lived there, poured into the halls of our tiny 5-story apartment building and down the narrow, steep stairs into the street. It was really late by then, and the streets were empty except for all of us standing there. Some people were wrapped in sheets over their night clothes. "Thank goodness it's summer," Mother said. Hardly anybody was fully dressed. As soon as the fire engines woke up the entire street, and people came from everywhere to see where the fire was coming from, but it was only in the basement. Firemen came in with their boots and helmets and big fire hoses, and in no time they put out the fire. Afterward, they let my brother Andrew and some of the other boys climb up into the fire truck and try on their firemen's hats. The adults gathered in groups and talked softly so the kids could hardly hear. There was a new little boy among us whom nobody knew. He was Mr. and Mrs. Mullen's little boy from the 5th floor. The superintendent brought him down in a wheelchair. Nobody knew him. Nobody knew he lived there. His mother and father were very quiet people. Hardly anyone ever saw them. Mr. Mullen was a night watchman in a warehouse, so he went to work late and came home early. And Mrs. Mullen only came out to buy groceries and go to church on Sunday. The little boy looked very strange as he sat twisting and turning in his wheelchair and reaching out to the other children, trying to grab their outstretched hands. He attempted to speak, but only grunts came out of his mouth. Some of the tenants remembered hearing strange sounds coming from the Mullins apartment, and after they'd hear, "Shh, shh," Mrs. Potter, the next-door neighbor, said, "I never had guessed that they had a little boy living there. We all thought that Mr. and Mrs. Mullen lived alone." "What's wrong with him?" one of the neighbors asked his mother. "Is he your boy? Does he live in the building?" Another neighbor asked, but Mrs. Mullen didn't answer. She just kept looking at her son, and he at her. "He seems so happy, and she's so sad." There were tears in her eyes, and his too. Oh, I'm going to go move my face out of this. The men in the building gathered around the boy's wheelchair and lifted him up and carried him upstairs. My mother and some of the other mothers put their arms around Mrs. Mullen. "God, don't put no more on us than we can bear, Mrs. Mullen," my mother said softly. "We understand." So her mother is giving her some advice, saying that God wouldn't have given her this son if he didn't think she could handle having him. The next day, on our way to school, we saw that same boy sitting in his wheelchair across the street in the sun. It was Kenneth Mullen, Jr. We knew now that he was 6 years old, and he had never been out in the sun until now. They said he had a disease that made him act funny and talk funny in grunts and groans. But Mr. Parker, who had a medical degree, though he worked in the post office, said he was a smart boy in the mind, but his body was sick, and that his disease was called multiple sclerosis, and there was no known cure for it. So that is still true today. There is no known cure for this disease. And I'm making a connection to our novel Out of My Mind. After the fire, Mr. and Mrs. Mullen didn't have to hide their little boy anymore. People in the neighborhood now knew him, and loved him too. Everybody's going to work and to school stopped by to see him. Just like that, Kenneth Mullen, Jr. was no longer the boy whom nobody knew. All right, and just a few things to think about is at this point in time, a lot of kids who were born with a disability or a disease such as this were not put in a school. That is something that I will get you some more information on, because I'm guessing if you are reading this and listening to this, you have a lot of questions.